Have you ever heard the story of the Russian sleep experiment? The one where 5 men were locked in a chamber, kept awake for 15 days, and ended up tearing themselves apart? I had repeated that line dozens of times into a microphone, my voice smooth and practiced for late-night listeners who thrived on conspiracy theories and dark legends. Most dismissed the tale as creepypasta, the internet's favorite urban myth. But for me, it was never just a story. It was a seed, planted years ago when I first read about it in some grainy forum thread at 2 in the morning, back when I was a teenager with insomnia and a taste for the macabre. That seed had grown into an obsession. By the time I launched my podcast, Echoes of the Forgotten, I had already interviewed former soldiers, fringe scientists, and even alleged remote viewers. None of their tales haunted me like the sleep experiment. The official line was clear: it never happened. A hoax. A piece of horror fiction dressed up as truth. And yet, scattered through history, I kept finding slivers, documents with blacked out lines, testimonies buried in obscure publications, rumors whispered by people who always asked not to be recorded. The more I dug, the more I became convinced something like it had happened. Maybe not exactly as the legend described, but real enough. And if it was real once, could it still be happening now? That question kept me awake at night, long after the mic was turned off and my listeners had gone to bed. My walls were covered in pinned-up notes and photographs, all connected with threads of red string like some crime drama cliché. I wasn't trying to be theatrical. It was just the only way I could make sense of the puzzle. One night, after finishing a late recording, I received an email that changed everything. The subject line was simple. "You're asking the wrong people." The sender's address was scrambled, untraceable. The body of the email was just a single line. "Try Budapest. Ask for the nurse who stitched the silent man." I stared at it for an hour, my pulse hammering in my ears. Most tips I got were jokes or elaborate fan fiction sent by overzealous listeners. But this one felt different. Specific. Almost personal. Budapest. A nurse. A silent man. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I dug. I found records of Soviet defectors who had fled to Hungary after the fall of the Union, including some with medical backgrounds. One name surfaced again and again: Anna Kovac, a military nurse who had worked in classified wards during the late 1940s and vanished from official records in the mid-60s. It wasn't much. But it was more than I had ever had before. A month later, I was on a plane, equipment bag at my feet, recording notes into my portable mic like a lunatic. I told my listeners I was chasing a new lead, something that might rewrite what they thought they knew about the most infamous horror story on the internet. I didn't tell them the truth, that I was terrified. Terrified that I would find nothing, or worse, that I would find something real. When I arrived in Budapest, the city greeted me with gray skies and damp cobblestones. I rented a small room in the old district, my window overlooking crumbling apartment blocks with laundry flapping like surrender flags. My translator, a young grad student named Martin, met me at the station. He thought I was writing a book. It was easier than explaining I was chasing ghosts. For 3 days, we asked around, community centers, nursing homes, hospitals. Most shook their heads. A few gave us strange looks when we mentioned her name, as if it was something dangerous to even remember. On the 4th day, Martin got a lead. An orderly at a retirement home on the outskirts said there was an old woman who matched the description. She rarely spoke, they said, but sometimes woke screaming in Russian, her hands clutching invisible wounds in the air. We went the next morning. The home was quiet, filled with the smell of antiseptic and overcooked cabbage. They led us to a garden where an old woman sat alone on a bench, her eyes pale and unfocused, her body small and fragile in a gray coat. "Anna?" Martin asked gently. Her head turned slowly. For a moment, her gaze locked with mine. And though her lips never moved, I swear I heard it, a whisper carried not through air but straight into my skull. You shouldn't have come. I froze, the world narrowing around me. Martin looked at me quizzically, clearly hearing nothing. My throat was dry as sandpaper. Anna Kovac? I asked, my voice trembling. Her lips curved faintly, not a smile, not exactly. More like recognition. She lifted a shaking hand and traced something in the air. At first I thought it was nonsense, but then I saw it clearly. A shape. A chamber. A door sealed shut. And 5 figures inside. My stomach dropped. She leaned closer, her voice rasping out like dry leaves. The silent man still breathes. They never stopped. They never stopped. The air around me felt heavier, pressing in on my lungs. I realized my recorder was still running. Her words, frail and broken as they were, had been captured. But then she gripped my wrist with surprising strength. Her nails dug into my skin as she hissed in Hungarian. Martin's face went pale. What did she say? I asked. He swallowed hard. She said, they're listening. Her grip didn't loosen, not even when her hand began to tremble. Her nails pressed into the skin of my wrist, sharp enough to sting. It wasn't just an old woman's twitch, it was deliberate, as if she wanted me to feel pain, to know this wasn't some half-forgotten rambling of dementia. Her eyes, cloudy but piercing, locked onto mine with unnerving clarity. They're listening, she rasped again, this time in broken English. The words seemed to scratch at her throat, as if unused for decades. Always listening. Through the walls, through the wires, through the air. She released me suddenly, as though the contact itself was dangerous, and curled her hands in her lap like a frightened child hiding something precious. Martin leaned closer to her, whispering rapidly in Hungarian. She stared at him, unblinking, then shook her head. Her gaze flicked back to me, and she raised her finger, pressing it hard against her lips. Silence. My recorder was still running. I slipped it deeper into my jacket pocket, angling the mic toward her. The tiny red light blinked like a heartbeat, the only proof I wasn't imagining this encounter. Finally, Anna spoke again. You know the story, she said. 5 men. 15 days. Gas to keep them awake. Her voice broke into a wheezing cough, but she pressed on. That part is true. All of it. They brought me in after it was over. Told me to stitch them. Patch them. Clean the mess. Her eyes seemed to sink deeper, as if she were seeing the chamber again right in front of her. It wasn't a chamber when I arrived, it was a slaughterhouse. Blood on the walls, words scratched into the steel, screams still echoing. I thought they were all dead. But one still breathed. I felt every hair on my arms rise. I had heard the legend countless times, retold by anonymous narrators online. But never like this. Never from someone who claimed to have been there. The silent man, she whispered. That's what we called him. His tongue, gone. He'd torn it out himself. But he looked at us, eyes open, and he kept moving. His body should have been finished, but he moved. And when I stitched him, when I pulled the needle through his flesh, her hand shook violently. He laughed. Without a tongue, without sound, he laughed. Martin shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me as though begging to leave. But I couldn't move. I was caught in her words, tangled in the nightmare she was weaving. They didn't kill him, she said. They couldn't. He didn't let them. Orders came to transfer him. No one asked where. We packed him into a truck, sealed in steel. I never saw him again. She leaned closer, her breath sour but warm against my cheek. But I still hear him. At night. Every night. A laugh with no tongue, no throat. In the walls. Her voice cracked, collapsing into a pitiful whisper. They never stopped. They couldn't stop. He wouldn't let them. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Where did they take him? Her face contorted, as though the question itself caused her pain. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, with a trembling finger, she pointed at the ground beneath us. Here. Not far. Buried under stone and dirt. They build over it. They always build over it. A nurse appeared in the doorway of the garden, calling Anna's name sharply in Hungarian. Anna flinched like a frightened animal. She gripped my wrist once more, her nails biting deep this time, and hissed something so fast I couldn't understand. Martin went pale again, grabbing my arm urgently. What did she say? I demanded. She said, his voice shook. Don't dig. Don't go down there. If you open the door, it won't close again. The nurse was already wheeling Anna away, scolding her gently like a child, though the old woman's cloudy eyes never left mine. She raised her hand weakly, not in farewell, but in warning, her index finger shaking as it pointed toward the ground again. By the time the door closed, the garden felt colder. The shadows stretched longer. My wrist still bore the marks of her nails, red crescents etched into my skin like sigils. That night, in my rented room, I replayed the recording over and over. Her voice cracked with age, but the conviction in her words was unmistakable. And buried beneath her rasping confession, I swore I heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sound that hadn't been present when she spoke in front of me. A laugh. Not human. Not full-throated. Just a rasp of air and broken vibration. My headphones slipped off as my stomach lurched. I stared at the recorder as if it were alive, as if something might crawl out from its speaker. I shut it off, but even in silence, I could still hear it. That impossible laugh. And for the first time since starting the podcast, I questioned whether I truly wanted answers. Because the truth didn't feel like something you uncovered. It felt like something that uncovered you. Sleep wouldn't come that night. Even when I shut off the recorder, shoved it into the drawer of the nightstand, and pulled the blanket over my head like a child hiding from monsters, the sound lingered. That horrible, dry, tongueless laugh. It replayed itself in my skull, not as sound, but as memory, like something I had personally witnessed instead of just recorded. My mind tried to rationalize it, faulty equipment, interference, wind across the mic. But none of those explanations erased the conviction I felt in my bones. That laugh was real. By the time the first gray light of dawn seeped through the curtains, I had given up on sleep entirely. I dragged myself to the small kitchen in my rented flat, poured bitter coffee into a chipped mug, and spread my research notes across the table. I told myself that I was here for answers, not superstition. Facts. History. That was what my listeners wanted, and it was what I wanted, wasn't it? I started with Anna's claim, here. Not far. Buried under stone and dirt. At first it sounded like a metaphor, but the way she pointed at the ground made me wonder if she meant it literally. Facilities, bunkers, old Soviet installations, Eastern Europe was littered with them, many officially erased from maps after the Cold War. If the experiment had continued, this was the perfect place to hide it. Martin arrived later that morning, his face pale from lack of sleep. I heard you pacing all night, he said. Couldn't rest either? I didn't tell him about the laugh. Not yet. Instead, I slid a stack of photocopied maps toward him, decades-old government charts I had requested from a contact weeks before. The ink was faded, the paper brittle, but the lines of roads and topography were clear. More importantly, they showed military zones long since abandoned. Or at least, abandoned on paper. There, I said, tapping a finger against the edge of one map. North of here, near the hills. A research facility, decommissioned in 1955. Officially, it was a munitions depot. But look at the annotations. Martin squinted. Underground chambers. Exactly. Multiple levels. Access tunnels. Closed off after the war. I traced a line across the page. Anna said they built over it. That's what this looks like. Sealed entrances, new roads, a residential district constructed right on top. He frowned. If it's sealed, how could anything still be inside? I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. That's what I'm going to find out. We spent the afternoon combing through municipal records at the local archive, a dust-choked building where bored clerks eyed us with suspicion. Most files had been purged, but fragments remained, permits for roadwork, odd spikes in electricity consumption during years when the facility was supposedly inactive, unexplained budget allocations funneled into public safety. The deeper we dug, the more it felt like a carefully stitched quilt of lies, each patch covering a hole they didn't want anyone to see. At one point, Martin slid a file across the desk with trembling fingers. Inside was a blurred black and white photograph of a concrete bunker entrance, half collapsed, surrounded by men in military coats. Scribbled on the margin in pencil, "Do not open until instructed." The hairs on the back of my neck rose. When the archive closed at dusk, we walked the streets in silence, the weight of our discovery pressing down. The town looked ordinary enough, children playing in yards, old women gossiping at windows, shopkeepers pulling down metal shutters, but now every crack in the pavement felt like it might hide a tunnel, every lamppost like it might hum with buried wires. That night, I uploaded my notes into the cloud but stopped short of recording a new podcast episode. For the first time, I hesitated to share what I had learned. It wasn't just fear of ridicule. It was something else, something primal, like the instinct that warns a deer away from water when it senses predators lurking nearby. Still, curiosity gnawed at me like hunger. By midnight, I had convinced Martin to drive with me to the northern edge of town, where the hills rose black against the star-scattered sky. We parked at the edge of a crumbling road and followed a dirt trail into the trees, guided only by the cold beam of my flashlight. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No owls, no rustling underbrush, just the crunch of our boots and the sound of our breathing, quick and shallow in the chill air. After 20 minutes, the beam of my flashlight struck something unnatural, a slab of weathered concrete jutting out of the hillside, half covered in moss and ivy. A door. Or what had once been a door. Rusted metal hinges clung to the concrete, but the entry itself had been sealed with slabs of stone and welded steel. Faded Cyrillic letters were stenciled across the surface, nearly illegible with time. I stepped closer, running my hand across the cold barrier. My pulse hammered. This was it. The facility Anna had spoken of. The place where the silent man had been taken. Then, as my fingers brushed a crack in the concrete, a sound bled through the silence. A scrape. Faint. Metallic. Martin froze beside me, eyes wide. We both pressed our ears against the wall. At first, there was nothing. Just the whisper of the night air. Then it came again, slow, deliberate. A dragging sound, like fingernails or metal claws raking against steel. Followed by something worse. A laugh. Dry. Broken. A hollow echo vibrating through the stone. My flashlight flickered. Martin grabbed my arm, his voice barely a breath. "Tell me you heard that." I wanted to deny it. To blame the wind, or the creak of old metal settling in the cold. But the sound was unmistakable. It was the same laugh I had heard in my recording, only louder. Closer. And this time, it didn't fade. It grew. The laugh vibrated through the concrete, a hideous rattle of air forced through a throat that should not be functioning. My stomach knotted, my mouth went dry, and for several seconds neither of us moved. The night pressed against us, heavier than it had any right to be, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Back away," Martin whispered. His grip on my arm tightened so hard it hurt. Now. Before. But before what? He didn't finish the thought, and I wasn't sure if he could. His wide eyes said enough. I should have listened. I should have turned and left, chalking the sound up to imagination or paranoia. But I'd come too far. My listeners, hell, I needed proof. Something tangible. A story this dark couldn't just stop at whispers and legends. I crouched, running my fingers along the base of the concrete barrier. Dirt had piled against it, but underneath, I found gaps, small fissures where the earth had settled unevenly. They were too narrow to crawl through, but when I pressed my ear close, the air leaking from inside was colder than the night, damp and metallic. It smelled faintly of rust and mold, and something sharper. Something coppery. Help me clear this, I said, already scraping dirt away with my hands. Martin hissed a curse in Hungarian and grabbed my shoulder. Are you insane? Didn't you hear what she said? Don't dig. Don't open it. Once it's open, it won't close again. I almost snapped at him, but then my flashlight flickered again, not from low battery, but as if something inside the chamber had interfered. A subtle pulse of static rippled through the air, crawling over my skin like invisible ants. I froze. On instinct, I switched off the light. The darkness swallowed us, thick and oppressive. For a moment, we were blind, breathing too loud, the forest pressing in. Then my eyes adjusted to the pale spill of moonlight filtering through the trees. The bunker loomed before us like the entrance to some tomb long forgotten, and the fissures in its surface looked wider than they had a moment ago. A low groan came from within. Not a laugh this time. A groan, deep and guttural, as though something massive was shifting in the dark, dragging itself closer to the sealed wall. Martin tugged me back. We have to go. Now. I wanted to argue, but the sound coming from inside made my bones vibrate. It wasn't just noise, it was pressure, like the air itself carried weight, squeezing my chest until each breath was shallow and desperate. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. We didn't run. Not yet. We retreated slowly, like prey hoping not to trigger the predator watching from the shadows. But the deeper into the forest we moved, the stronger the sense of pursuit became, as though something pressed against the barrier from inside, aware of us, following. By the time we reached the car, I was drenched in sweat despite the chill night. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the keys twice before jamming them into the ignition. When the headlights flared to life, Martin gasped. Behind us, at the edge of the treeline, the bunker was still visible. But the fissures glistened now, wet with condensation, as though the concrete itself had started to breathe. We didn't speak the whole drive back. I should have stopped. Any sane person would have. But the next morning, after a night of restless half-sleep filled with muffled laughter echoing from the walls of my rented flat, I found myself back at the archive. My hands moved through the boxes like they had a will of their own, searching for anything that could explain what we'd heard. What I found was worse than silence. A file marked C347, restricted. The paper was brittle, the ink smudged, but the words were still legible enough to turn my stomach. It detailed subject transfer protocols from the late 1950s. Survivors from the initial experiment, plural, not singular, as the legend suggested, had been relocated to multiple facilities across Eastern Europe. One such site was right here, under the hills we'd visited. Subjects were described not as prisoners, but as assets. Worse still, the report mentioned incidents of vocalization persisting after full physiological failure. In other words, laughter after death. I slammed the file shut, suddenly aware of how silent the archive had become. The hum of fluorescent lights above seemed too loud, too sharp. I glanced around the room, but the clerk who had been sitting behind the desk was gone. The entire floor was empty. And yet, faintly, from the rows of shelves. A chuckle. Low, broken, rattling through the stacks of paper like a breeze. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, heart hammering so hard it drowned out thought. My eyes scanned the shadows between shelves, but no one was there. Then I noticed my phone buzzing in my pocket. With trembling hands, I pulled it free. The screen lit up with a new notification, audio recording saved. Confused, I opened it. The file had been created just moments ago, but I hadn't touched the recorder app. I pressed play. Static filled my ears, crackling and warping, and beneath it, my own voice spoke. But it wasn't something I remembered saying. It was me, whispering, "The door is open." My blood ran cold. My phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, the recording still playing, repeating those words over and over. "The door is open. The door is open. The door is open." I ran from the archive, out into the daylight, gasping like I'd just surfaced from drowning. But even under the sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd already gone too far. That maybe the door wasn't just a metaphor anymore. Maybe it truly was open. Back in my flat, I sat at the table with the blinds drawn tight, the recorder, my phone, and the file from the archive spread out before me like pieces of evidence in a crime I was beginning to regret investigating. My heart hadn't slowed since I fled that building, and my skin prickled with the uneasy certainty that I hadn't left the presence of whatever I had heard. It felt like something had followed me, not physically, but like an echo that had latched onto my breath, my shadow, my thoughts. I pressed play on the audio file again. My own voice whispered those 4 words, calm and measured, nothing like the way my voice normally shook when I was afraid. "The door is open." The repetition looped endlessly, crackling with faint static, as if the file were corrupted. I shut it off, but the silence that followed wasn't better. It felt thicker, heavier, like the absence of sound was being forced upon the room. The phone buzzed suddenly against the tabletop. Caller ID, unknown. I hesitated, then answered. The line crackled. At first, nothing but white noise. Then, faintly, words. Not spoken, but hissed, distorted through some mechanical throat. "You opened it." The phone went dead before I could respond. My hand shook as I set it down, nearly knocking over my mug of stale coffee. It wasn't just superstition anymore. Whatever I had brushed up against, it had noticed me. And it wasn't bound to the bunker in the hills, it had found a way into the wires, the airwaves, the devices we trusted every day. I turned on my recorder, determined to capture proof, but all I got was more static. I replayed it twice, 3 times, slowing it down, filtering out the noise. And then I heard it, layered beneath the hiss. Not words this time, but breathing. Ragged, shallow, too close to the mic. As though someone else sat across the table from me, invisible, sharing the air I exhaled. I pushed the recorder away, revulsion knotting my gut, and pressed my palms hard against my eyes. Get a grip, I told myself. You're a journalist. A podcaster. Not a ghost hunter. But when I opened my eyes again, the red crescents Anna had clawed into my wrist were still there, inflamed now, as if fresh. The marks almost looked like something carved deliberately, symbols, maybe, though too crude to recognize. A knock jolted me upright. 3 sharp raps against the door. I froze. No one knocked like that here. Neighbors didn't just visit. And Martin had a key. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept to the peephole, every muscle in my body rigid. But when I pressed my eye to the glass, no one was there. Only the dim hallway stretched out silent, the wallpaper peeling, the light bulb flickering. And yet, I swear I heard breathing, just beyond the wood. I backed away slowly. My foot caught on the corner of the rug, and the recorder slid off the table with a clatter, hitting the floor. The playback activated itself, and the voice that spilled out wasn't mine this time. It was low. Croaking. Wet with a sound that didn't belong to any living throat. 15 days. The voice dragged, distorted, then dissolved into that same dry, tongueless laugh. The recorder shut off on its own. I didn't move for a long time. Just sat there in the dim room, staring at the little black device as if it had grown teeth. The air felt thinner with every breath, like I was trapped in a chamber with walls closing in. When Martin finally came by, hours later, he found me still sitting there in the half-dark, my eyes raw, my hands clenched into fists. "You look like hell," he said, but his voice lacked humor. He glanced at the recorder, then at me, lowering his voice. "I got a call today. From a number I didn't recognize. They said my name. They said your name. And then, they laughed." His hands trembled as he rubbed his face. "We need to stop this. Burn the notes, delete the recordings, forget this place." I should have agreed. Every instinct in me screamed that continuing was suicide. But that hunger, the need for answers, was still gnawing at me. Anna's words, the file, the sound in the bunker. They had locked onto me. And a part of me was terrified that if I didn't keep digging, the thing would come anyway. "Show me where the power lines go," I said finally. "If it's in the wires, I want to know where they lead." Martin's face drained of color. He shook his head, but I saw it in his eyes. He already knew. He had grown up here. He had seen the odd substations in the woods, the strange humming fences no one explained, the neighborhoods that never lost power even during storms. That night, against every instinct of survival, we followed the power lines north. Through back roads and silent stretches of farmland, past abandoned rail yards and forgotten factories, until the lines led us to something I can only describe as wrong. A facility. Hidden in plain sight. Squat concrete buildings ringed with chain-link fences and barbed wire, floodlights sweeping the perimeter. Not abandoned, not derelict, active. From the road, we saw trucks moving in and out, men in dark uniforms patrolling. No insignia, no flags, just blank black vans and the glint of rifles. And behind it all, at the far end of the compound, a cluster of transmission towers stabbed into the night sky, their red lights blinking like warning beacons. The wires hummed. My recorder, switched off in my pocket, began to vibrate. And in the hum, layered so faintly I almost thought I imagined it, I heard the same voice whisper again. 15 days. The facility sat like a tumor on the land, a cluster of concrete structures squatting beneath the night sky, their floodlights stabbing through the dark like accusing fingers. From the ridge where Martin and I crouched, the whole place hummed faintly. It wasn't just the wires, it was the ground itself, vibrating beneath our palms. The hum felt alive, like a giant animal's slow, steady heartbeat pulsing beneath the earth. I should have turned back. The sight alone was enough to confirm what Anna had said, it never ended. That should have been enough. I could have recorded the hum, taken photographs of the faceless guards, published a series of episodes that hinted at the truth without walking straight into it. My listeners would have eaten it up. But something had already sunk its claws into me, dragging me closer, whispering in that rasping voice that I couldn't stop now. Martin swore under his breath. These men aren't police. Not military, either. No insignias, just shadows. He tugged at my sleeve. We can't get closer. They'll shoot. But as he said it, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest trace of something that made my gut twist. A smell. Metallic. Sharp. Copper and rot. Blood. I swallowed hard. If there's blood, it means there's something alive in there. Martin stared at me as though I'd just confessed to murder. You want proof so badly you'll die for it? Not die, I said, though my voice wavered. Just see. We waited until the patrol swept past the outer fence before creeping down the ridge, keeping low in the grass. My pulse roared in my ears, but somehow, against reason, we made it to a line of shadow where an abandoned maintenance shed leaned against the fence. Its roof was half collapsed, its walls splintered. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. From there, we were closer, close enough to hear the faint scrape of boots on gravel, the occasional barked word in Russian, and beneath it all, voices. Not from the guards. From deeper within the compound. I pressed my ear against the shed wall, my breath hitching. At first, it sounded like chanting. Low, overlapping murmurs, hundreds of voices whispering at once. But as my ears adjusted, the truth made bile rise in my throat. It wasn't chanting. It was pleading. Voices begging for release, speaking in broken tones, gasping and sobbing between words. A chorus of the damned. Martin's hand clamped over mine, dragging me back. His face was ashen, his lips trembling. That's not possible. That many people can't be underground. There's no room. There's... His words cut off as floodlights swung in our direction. We dove flat against the dirt, pressing into the weeds, barely daring to breathe. The beam swept past, lingering for a heartbeat too long before moving on. When it was gone, I realized my recorder had slipped from my pocket, its little red light blinking. I snatched it back, shutting it off, but not before noticing the display. Recording, 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I hadn't pressed record. I scrolled back, playing the beginning through my headphones. Static. Then a man's voice, hoarse, guttural, half choking on its own words. Don't let us sleep. The voice cut into screams, joined by others, until the recording became a cacophony of terror. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped it again. Martin leaned close, his whisper a hiss of panic. We're leaving. Now. Or we'll end up in there with them. But before I could respond, a new sound drifted across the compound. A laugh. Not faint. Not distant. This was louder than ever before, booming across the facility like it was piped through the towers themselves, shaking the air, making the metal fence rattle. The guards froze. For the first time, I saw fear flash across their faces. One of them muttered something in Russian and crossed himself. Another barked orders, but his voice cracked. The floodlights swept wildly, the dogs tethered to the perimeter began to howl, and beneath it all, the laugh deepened, rolling like thunder from the bowels of the compound. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. And it didn't stop. We fled. I don't even remember running, just the blur of dark trees whipping past, my lungs burning, my heart hammering until I thought my chest would split. By the time we reached the car, both of us collapsed against the doors, gasping for breath like hunted animals. Neither of us spoke on the drive back. What was there to say? We had heard the impossible. Proof that the legend wasn't a campfire story, wasn't creepypasta, it was a living, breathing nightmare that hadn't ended. But as the town's lights reappeared on the horizon, I realized the laugh was still with me. Not in the air, not in the car. Inside. Reverberating through my skull like an echo I couldn't shake. And with every mile we drove, it grew stronger. Sleep was impossible that night. Even after Martin dropped me off at the shabby guest house where I was staying, even after I triple-locked the door and pushed a dresser in front of it, I couldn't close my eyes without hearing the laughter replaying inside my skull. It had rooted itself deep, echoing in the soft tissue of my brain, reshaping the silence around me. No amount of noise from the television or the static hiss of my recorder could mask it. When I finally gave in and stared at the ceiling in the dim glow of a flickering lamp, I understood something chilling. It wasn't just sound. It was presence. By morning, my hands shook so badly I could hardly lace my boots. I splashed water on my face, trying to feel human, and forced myself to eat something, though the food tasted like cardboard and ash. Then, with a trembling kind of determination, I called Martin. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual bluster, but he agreed to meet at his office. He didn't want to talk about last night over the phone. When I arrived, his office looked different. Papers that had once been scattered were now stacked neatly. His walls, once cluttered with photographs and news clippings, had been stripped bare. He was packing, though he hadn't admitted it yet. "You're leaving," I said. He froze, one hand still on a box of documents. For a long moment, he didn't look at me. Then he muttered, "You should too. Whatever that place is, it's not meant for us." We brushed against it, and that's more than most outsiders ever survive. His voice dropped. "And it knows now." That last phrase lodged in me like a splinter. It knows now. I asked him if he still had access to the archives, the old medical files he had mentioned on the drive. At first, he resisted, shaking his head furiously, saying we had already gone too far. But when I pulled out my recorder and played him the 15-minute segment from last night, the static giving way to pleading voices, the gurgled screams, something broke in him. His hands trembled as he pulled open a drawer and dropped a stack of folders on the desk. "Take them," he whispered. "But don't bring them back here. Don't bring any of it back here." The folders were thick, yellowed with age, their corners curled. I carried them back to my guest house like stolen treasure, my heart pounding with each step as though I expected faceless guards to emerge from the shadows and snatch them away. Once inside, I spread the contents across the rickety table by the window. Pages of handwritten notes in Russian, stamped forms from hospitals that no longer existed, diagrams of the human brain with crude annotations scribbled in red ink. But it wasn't the text that froze me, it was the photographs. Grainy black and white images clipped to the files. Men and women with gaunt faces and hollow eyes, their skin blotched and sagging as though stretched too thin over their skulls. Some had mouths sewn crudely at the corners, the stitches puckering the flesh. Others were strapped to chairs, their limbs restrained, their eyes propped open by metal clamps. But what caught me most were the expressions. None of them looked like patients. They didn't look alive, not fully. Their gazes were too sharp, too fixed, too aware. In every image, no matter how grotesque, the eyes glittered with something more than fear. Something closer to hunger. I forced myself to flip through more, telling myself I was documenting, investigating, keeping the distance of a professional. But my breath faltered when I reached one particular folder. It was dated 1949. A man, strapped upright in a chair. His skin was torn around the wrists where leather straps had cut deep. His lips were cracked, but he was smiling. A wide, crooked grin that seemed too deliberate to be pain. Beneath the photo, typed neatly in Russian. Subject 12, terminated after 276 hours. Terminated. But the eyes in the photograph, they weren't dead. I could feel them pressing into me even through the paper, alive with some unnatural spark. And then, as I flipped the photo over, I froze. Because written in faded pencil on the back were two words, in English, not Russian. Still here. I sat there, gripping the photo until my knuckles whitened, my mind whirling. Who had written that? A guard? A doctor? Or the subject himself, somehow, long after he was supposedly terminated? I needed air. I staggered to the window, flung it open, and gulped down the cold breeze. My pulse hammered against my ribs. But when I looked across the street, my breath caught. A man was standing there. At first, I thought it was a trick of exhaustion. He was half shrouded by shadow, his figure stiff, motionless. But as a car passed, the headlights illuminated his face. It was the man from the photograph. Older, yes. His skin sagged more, his cheeks hollowed by decades. But the grin was unmistakable. And his eyes, those glittering eyes, they locked on me with a recognition that churned my stomach into ice. I stumbled back from the window, crashing into the table, scattering papers everywhere. My recorder hit the floor, the little red light flicking on as if it had chosen this moment to wake. The air in the room thickened, charged, like the hum of the compound had followed me here. By the time I crawled back to the window, the man was gone. The street was empty, still, as if no one had been there at all. But on the glass, faint and smeared by a trembling finger, was a word. Awake. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the old guest house floorboards made me jolt upright, convinced someone was in the room. The radiator hissed like a whispering voice. My own breath sounded foreign, too loud, as though it belonged to someone standing just behind me. When dawn finally pushed through the thin curtains, it didn't bring relief. Instead, it only revealed how gray and lifeless the town looked, as if the night had stolen color from everything. I gathered the files, stuffing them into a duffel bag with frantic hands, my mind replaying the image of that man across the street, the grin, the eyes, the words smeared into the glass. Awake. My pulse spiked every time I thought about it. I told myself it was impossible. No one could survive 70 years after being terminated in a facility that should have been buried by history. But denial is fragile, and when I glanced into the mirror above the sink, I saw what I feared most, not just the panic in my own eyes, but the faintest trace of that same spark I had seen in his. By the time I stepped outside, the town felt wrong. Too still. The shopkeepers who had been cheerful and talkative when I arrived now avoided my gaze. People on the street walked a little faster, as if eager to escape the daylight. And then there were the ones who did look at me. Not many, but enough. A woman at a bakery window, her face pale and thin. A man leaning against a lamppost, his eyes following me without a blink. Their stares didn't feel curious or hostile. They felt familiar. Recognizing. As though they knew me. I tried to convince myself I was paranoid, but it was impossible to ignore the details. The way their movements were slightly too stiff, their smiles lingering a beat too long. The way their eyes, those unnatural, gleaming eyes, caught the light in ways normal eyes shouldn't. They weren't just strangers. They were watchers. I ducked into a cafe, trying to lose the weight of those stares. The place was nearly empty, except for an elderly man hunched in the corner. I ordered coffee, hands trembling so badly I nearly spilled it, then slid into a booth. For a few blessed minutes, I almost convinced myself the world was normal again. Then the man in the corner laughed. It wasn't loud, but it had the same cadence, the same rising pitch that I'd heard echoing from the compound. My head snapped up, and I saw him watching me, his lips curled into a smile that didn't belong to his face. He looked frail, skin sagging from his bones, but the laughter was strong, deep, resonant. I left the coffee untouched and bolted from the cafe. On the street, the watchers were still there, scattered among the crowd. Their gazes pricked at the back of my neck, following every step. I ducked down side streets, weaving through alleys, but no matter how fast I moved, no matter how many corners I turned, at least one of them was always waiting, leaning against a wall, standing still at a crossing, or simply standing in the open with that same too-wide grin. By the time I stumbled back to the guest house, drenched in sweat and nearly collapsing from exhaustion, I was convinced of two things. 1, I wasn't imagining this. And 2, these people weren't random townsfolk. They were connected to the experiment. Survivors who should have been buried decades ago. Subjects who had slipped out of that facility, scattered into the world, and were now hiding in plain sight, waiting for something I couldn't yet name. That night, as I sat by the window with the files spread before me, I noticed something new in one of the folders. I swore it hadn't been there before. A photograph of a group of men, sitting stiffly in a row, their eyes wide and unblinking. On the back, in faint handwriting, it read, "Integration begins." I stared at those words, my throat dry. Integration. Not just containment, not just survival. A merging. A spreading. That was when the knock came at my door. Soft. Polite. Almost ordinary. I froze, staring at the wood, every nerve in my body screaming not to move. The knock came again, 3 times, patient. And then a voice, muffled but clear. "Open the door. We know you're awake." My breath hitched. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were spoken, in a chorus. Not one voice, but many, layered over one another, as though the hallway outside was filled with dozens of throats speaking in perfect unison. I backed away, gripping my recorder like a weapon. The chorus continued, softer now, almost coaxing. "You've seen us. You know the truth. You belong with us. Open the door." The dresser rattled as if something pressed against it. I stumbled backward, crashing into the table, scattering papers. The recorder in my hand flicked on again of its own accord, the red light glowing. Through the static came a sound, my own voice, recorded earlier. Only it wasn't me speaking. "Still here." And then the laughter began. I didn't open the door. I didn't dare. I sat in the corner of the guest house room all night, gripping the recorder like it was a crucifix, listening to the voices seep through the cracks around the doorframe. Sometimes they whispered, sometimes they laughed, sometimes they simply repeated the same phrase over and over, "We know you're awake." They didn't pound on the door. They didn't try to break it down. They just waited, patient and certain, as if they knew I couldn't hide forever. When dawn finally came, the hallway outside was silent. The voices had vanished. But the word smeared across the inside of my window, "Awake," was still there, faint but undeniable. I knew then that the watchers weren't going to kill me, at least not yet. They wanted something else. They wanted me to see. I gathered the files into my duffel bag, my hands trembling so hard I almost tore the pages. I didn't know if Martin was still in town, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Running wouldn't help either. Wherever I went, they would follow. Their eyes were already in every crowd, every street. The only choice left was the one I had sworn I'd never take. I had to go back to the compound. The drive out of town felt unreal, like I was slipping further from the world of the living with each passing mile. The roads were empty, the fields vast and silent. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the sky. My headlights carved through the morning fog, and the deeper I went, the stronger that vibration in the earth became. The hum of the facility was no longer a faint background noise, it was alive, pulsing, growing louder as though it recognized me coming back. By the time I reached the ridge overlooking the compound, the guards were gone. The watchtowers were empty, their lights still burning but no movement visible. The place looked abandoned, but I knew better. Facilities like this never die. They burrow deeper. They become invisible. I parked the car half hidden in the trees and approached on foot. The gates hung open, chains dangling as if someone, or something, had broken them from the inside. My throat went dry as I stepped across the threshold. The air was heavy here, thick with a copper tang that clung to the back of my tongue. Each step echoed, not just in the gravel but in my skull, as though the ground itself remembered every footfall of every victim that had ever walked across it. Inside the main building, the hallways were stripped bare. Peeling paint. Rusted pipes. Long corridors that smelled of mold and dust. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but that was a lie. Beneath the dust, I saw boot prints. Fresh. Too many to count. I moved deeper, my recorder on, its red light blinking in the dark. Static filled the air around me, crackling like distant fire. Then, faintly, words emerged through the static. Not from me. Not from the past. From now. Keep going. I froze. My breath came fast, shallow. The voice wasn't urging or threatening, it was simply matter of fact, a command spoken by something that already knew my choice. Room after room I passed, cells with rusted metal beds, restraints bolted to the floor, claw marks on the walls where fingernails had been torn away. In one cell, I found a pair of shackles still warm to the touch. In another, a mattress with indentations, as if someone had just risen from it. The laughter returned then, faint at first, curling through the halls like smoke. It grew louder with every turn I took, guiding me deeper, herding me towards something waiting below. I found the stairwell at the far end of the corridor. Concrete steps spiraled downward into darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The laughter followed me, reverberating in the walls until I couldn't tell if it was behind me, above me, or inside me. At the bottom, the hallway opened into a vast chamber. And that's where I saw them. Rows of glass cylinders, stretching into the shadows, each filled with a cloudy, viscous liquid. Inside floated shapes, human, or almost human. Some were emaciated, their bodies little more than bones and skin stretched thin. Others were swollen, grotesque, their features warped by whatever had been done to them. But their eyes were wide open, staring, unblinking. Awake. The sight nearly drove me to my knees. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, suspended in those tanks, each one alive in some terrible way. Their mouths twitched. Their fingers flexed. Bubbles of air slipped from their throats as if they were trying to speak through the liquid. And then, as I stood there trembling, one of the tanks closest to me lit up. A pale, green glow flickered from within, illuminating the figure inside. My stomach turned to ice when I saw the face. It was mine. Not a reflection. Not a trick of the light. My face, staring back at me through the glass. The same jawline, the same hair, the same scar above my eyebrow. Its lips curled into a smile I didn't recognize, and its eyes, those eyes glittered with hunger. My recorder slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The figure in the tank raised its hand, pressing it against the glass, and I felt the pressure in my own palm as if it were touching me through the barrier. The laughter erupted again, deafening now, booming through the chamber until the tanks themselves began to shake. Cracks spiderwebbed across the glass. The liquid inside churned violently. And in the chaos, one word echoed through the static of the recorder, spoken by hundreds of overlapping voices. Replace. The chamber roared like a living creature, the sound of glass straining, of water sloshing, of voices rising in a collective crescendo that had no source and no mercy. My double inside the tank pressed harder against the glass, its grin spreading wider than should have been possible, teeth glinting under the green glow. Its lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I knew them all the same. Words I had already heard whispered in dreams and hissed through the static of my recorder. You were never investigating us. You were remembering us. My breath caught in my throat. The room spun. For a terrible moment I thought I might collapse, but the fear that bolted through my body kept me upright. All around me, the tanks began to fracture, hairline cracks spreading like lightning across their glass walls. The figures inside stirred, mouths twitching, eyes darting, as though roused from an endless, ageless slumber. The laughter was unbearable now, vibrating through the marrow of my bones, shaking the ground beneath me. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting from one tank to another, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. Faces blurred past, men, women, twisted forms that were once human but no longer deserved the name. Yet each pair of eyes I met carried the same glimmer, the same impossible hunger. They weren't begging for freedom. They weren't victims. They were waiting. The tank holding my double groaned, fissures webbing outward until the glass shattered with a sound like a scream. Viscous liquid exploded across the floor, drenching me in a stench so foul it clawed down my throat. My double collapsed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, coughing, retching out bile, then slowly rising to its feet. It stood taller than me. Straighter. Stronger. And when it looked at me, it wasn't with recognition. It was with possession. You left us, it rasped, its voice a perfect echo of mine, but deeper, layered with something inhuman beneath it. But we never left you. I staggered backward, shaking my head, bile rising in my throat. I'm not. The words died. Because in that moment, I remembered. Not a memory like childhood, not a fragment of the past, but a revelation pouring into me like molten fire. I had been here before. Not as a journalist. Not as an outsider. I had been one of them. Subject 12. My mind reeled, images flashing, restraints cutting into my wrists, clamps prying my eyes open, the endless hum of the machines keeping me from sleep. The experiment wasn't something I'd uncovered. It was something I had lived. And somehow, I had been released, not escaped, released, with my memories scrubbed clean, sent out into the world as bait. The double lunged forward, seizing me by the shoulders with hands that were my own. Its breath was hot against my face, sour with decades of rot. You were meant to return. We left you awake, out there, so you could bring us back to the world. I struggled, pushing against it, but it was like wrestling my own shadow, every movement matched, every strain mirrored. Around us, more tanks burst, figures collapsing onto the wet concrete, crawling, twitching, rising one by one. The watchers, the survivors I had seen in the town, had been only fragments, the first wave of integration. But this was the flood. The recorder on the ground sparked, its static cutting through the chaos. A chorus of voices poured from it, every one layered over the next, speaking directly into my skull. The world is tired. The world is weak. We will keep it awake. The word awake rattled through my teeth, a command and a curse. My double's grip tightened, its grin splitting wider, its eyes blazing with a light that was not human. No more dreams. No more silence. Awake forever. The others joined in now, staggering forward, their movements jerky but relentless. Their laughter filled the chamber, blending into a single sound that was both joy and torment. They weren't coming for me alone. They were coming for everyone. In those final moments, as the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with their hunger, I realized the true horror: sleep was never the enemy. Dreams were. Dreams are where we are free, where we escape them. And that is why they were kept awake, why we will all be kept awake. Because once they tear sleep from the world, there will be no refuge left. No silence. No forgetting. Only endless, ravenous wakefulness. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was my own face grinning down at me, whispering through teeth that were mine, but not mine. You were never investigating the experiment. You are the experiment. And then, nothing. Nothing, except the laughter. If the shadows of tonight's story still haunt your mind, remember, darkness is never far away. I'm Mr. Dread Tales, and I'll be back to whisper the nightmares you didn't know were waiting. Don't sleep, and don't forget to subscribe, because the next tale might be closer than you think.